we can start. So hello, everybody. My name is Marco Formisano. I teach Latin literature at Ghent University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to this roundtable organized by the GIKS, the Ghent Institute of Classical Study, based at Ghent University. And I am the chair of this institute. During this difficult period, we thought it might be a good idea to launch a series of online events just to keep our activity lively. And I mean, again, it was a possibility to do this very interdisciplinary and very international meetings, thanks also to this specific medium. So not everything is bad right now, at least that. And the former roundtable, so this is the second of a three roundtable series. The former roundtable was on trees, a conversation about trees, both in ancient and contemporary literature. This event will be on things, and the next event is I anticipate is going to be like this late spring, and the topic will be sound. So we have a nice trio of nice non-human, let's say, elements. In this series, we combine inputs from scholars belonging to different specialties of literary and cultural studies. And our intention is, of course, to bring in dialogue both different cultures and texts or artifacts produced in completely different cultures, both in history and in geography, and also, of course, to discuss about different approaches and to compare them in what we believe it's an interesting interaction between disciplines. So today we are going to discuss more in particular the presence of things in different contexts. As I said, first in Greek and Roman ancient cultures, then in Byzantine art and culture, and of course then in contemporary theory and contemporary literature. So each speaker, let me remind you very quickly, each speaker will present for about 20 minutes. I propose to have a break after the second presentation, only 5 minutes. So that would be after Sarah's talk. And after the fourth talk, i.e. the talk by Glenn Pierce, so we're gonna have the final discussion with all participants. You are all familiar with the Zoom, I guess, but I would like to ask you to silence your microphones, so those who are not speaking. And of course, at the end, you are welcome to ask questions. Please let me know first in the chat. So you can just put a request in the chat. You don't need to write the question. I would give you the word following the order of appearances. So at this point, let me introduce you the first speaker of our program, Marco Caracciolo, who is my colleague at Ghent University. He's professor of English literature and comparative literature, and he is also the principal investigator of an ERC bearing the title Narrating the Mesh, Ecology and Non-Human in Contemporary Fiction and Oral Storytelling. So, of course, I'm not going to repeat all the massive publication lists of Marco and of all the speakers, but I would like to point just to a book which has been just published, I guess, with the Virginia University Press, with the title again, Narrating the Mesh, Form and Story in the Anthropocene. And the title of his talk is Notes for an Object-Oriented Narratology. Okay, Marco, yours is the floor.
Wonderful. Thanks for the introduction, Marco. It's a great pleasure to be here. Can you all hear me? Does the sound okay? Okay, perfect. All right, so I will start by sharing my slides. There we go. So yeah, as Marco said, this is based on the research project I'm working on at the moment. And I'm trying to integrate things more in my research process. So far I've been working on environments, non-human animals, and with this presentation, which is why I was so happy to receive this invitation from Marco, I'm moving in the direction of what I call rather ambitiously an object-oriented narratology. We'll see. So my starting point is a rather obscure text from the Victorian period. This is a work for a young audience. It's a children's book essentially by Carey, who writes autobiographies of objects. As you can see from the title on the slide, this is a collection of stories that feature non-human narrators. And of course, the purpose, as I said, is didactic. The purpose is to involve children and to impart knowledge about certainly the natural world, but especially how the natural world can benefit humans. So I'm starting from this as essentially a counterexample to what I want to argue in this presentation. So this is a text that very clearly stages non-human things, but it does not create an object-oriented narrative as I define the term. So just to give you a very quick, but I think a very meaningful example. This is from the first autobiography, the Autobiography of a Lump of Coal. And this is what the coal says. It is my great desire and constant tendency to unite with my friend Oxygen, while by so doing I can in any way benefit your human race. So essentially it doesn't get more anthropocentric than that. Here we have a lump of coal saying that it looks forward to becoming fuel for the benefit of human societies. So this is certainly an instance of how narrative can center on things, but it's not a narrative that is object-oriented in the way I want to talk about in this presentation, insofar as it is a narrative that reinforces anthropocentric assumptions about non-human materiality, whereas I'm interested in narratives that question these assumptions, narratives that bring out the elusiveness of things, the inaccessibility of things, all of the features of things that have been explored by non-human oriented philosophy in fields like object-oriented ontology and new materialism. So the way I think about object-oriented narrative is as a form of narrative that foregrounds the vibrant quality of things or thing power, the material agency, if you want to use another phrase, of things, and how it eludes human grasp, human comprehension, but also perhaps the purposes of human subjects. Okay, so in this way, narrative articulates a broader critique of anthropocentrism, right? Now, I started from that example, which does not support my claim about object-oriented narrative, because I think it's important to keep in mind that things are, pervasive in stories. They are an important part of quest narratives, for example, that focus on objects, that use objects as the object of human desire. These stories foreground things insofar as they are invested with symbolic meanings or monetary or economic value, right? So a lot of times when we find an object in narrative, it's an object that is entangled within an anthropocentric grid. And that is, of course, no coincidence. If you look at contemporary narrative theory, a very important contribution to the study of narrative is this book by Monika Fludernik, who argues that storytelling as a practice has an anthropomorphic bias. So stories tend to gravitate towards human scale events, human scale psychology, so that even if stories stage objects, foreground objects, they tend to be implicated within a human psychological trajectory. Of course, this is not the case for all stories. It's very hard to generalize, but it is a tendency, it is a bias inherent in storytelling. And in this project, I'll be looking at narratives that foreground things in order to question Western dichotomies, particularly dichotomies that have to do with the idea that matter is inherently inert or passive, and oppose that passivity to the active nature of the human subject. So there are instances in stories in which that anthropocentric bias of storytelling is undercut and questioned, and that is where non-human materiality comes to the fore. So that is the kind of object-oriented narrative that I want to explore, and I will discuss in this presentation. My interest is in contemporary literature, and this, of course, reflects also the focus of the NARMESH project that Marco mentioned in the introduction. Of course, the topic of how narrative can unsettle human assumptions is a vast topic. Here, I want to give you two glimpses into how story can decenter the human. And these are, I call them tropes, but they are actually devices that straddle the divide between form and theme. So I would say the Anthropocene Museum, which is the first trope I will interrogate, is more on the side of the thematic dimension of text. The second device, the object-oriented plotting that I discuss, is more on the formal side of things. But actually, as I hope my examples will illustrate, it's very hard to extricate the formal from the thematic in the kind of texts that I want to talk about, because the formal seems to pursue a thematic interest, and conversely, the themes that are explored by these texts seem to be grounded in formal strategy. So that is the kind of dialogue that I want to explore in relation to a set of narratives, a set of contemporary narratives that are object-oriented. Okay, so the Anthropocene Museum. The starting point here is, of course, the museum as a space, as an environment in which human, non-human relations are imagined. And of course, there are many possibilities, but if we think about the traditional museum as it has been handed down to us by essentially Enlightenment thinking, the museum becomes a space of classification, a space of taxonomy that by and large tends to reinforce an anthropocentric understanding of things. And this is really visualized by these museum cases and cabinets that create a physical barrier between the subject, the person visiting the museum, and the object that is on display. So the physical distance of the traditional museum, let's say, is an objective embodiment or equivalent of the subject-object divide that we associate with Western modernity. So that's the traditional conception of the museum. You can see here on the slide, that's the British Museum, which is one of the earliest museum in Europe, and a space that originally, arguably, was meant to affirm dualistic binaries in a way that supports an anthropocentric worldview. Now, the museum becomes an important trope in a strand of contemporary literature that explores non-human materiality. But this kind of literature does not refer to the Enlightenment Museum, but goes further back in time, or at least that's my argument, that in the kind of literature that stages the museum and the vibrant quality of matter through the museum, it's no longer the Enlightenment classifying house that plays a role. It is an earlier way of thinking about museum exhibitions, which has to do with the pre-modern cabinet of curiosities. So of course, there are a lot of historical continuities between museums as contemporary or modern institutions and the cabinet of curiosities. But there are also some very important differences. And I can very warmly recommend this book you can see here on the slide, Future Remains, that explores a number of Anthropocene objects through the lens of the cabinet of curiosity. So the editors went back to this earlier way of thinking about objects. And if they find that way of thinking about objects particularly productive in the context of the climate crisis and the Anthropocene. So what is the difference between the Anthropocene, what is the difference between the Enlightenment Museum and the pre-modern cabinet of curiosities? Well, the cabinet of curiosities is not a space that is primarily organized according to taxonomies, but actually tends to foreground parallels, juxtapositions, correspondences. They are not strictly taxonomic. So these combinations of things that don't seem to have a lot in common are, of course, a source of wonder, hence the German term Wunderkammer. But they are also a source of non-human materiality, or something that exposes the inherent vibrant nature of matter through these unlikely juxtapositions. So this way of thinking about museum spaces becomes an important trope in contemporary Anthropocene-focused literature. And here I will only have time to briefly talk about a very interesting book by a contemporary American poet, Brenda Shaughnessy. It's called The Octopus Museum. And it is a collection of poems, but it's also a narrative to some degree, because it has this frame narrative, which is fundamentally a post-apocalyptic scenario. And the literary conceit here is that we have a fictional museum that was curated after the fall of humankind by what the text refers to as our octopoid overlords. So the idea is that octopi become the ruling species on Earth, and after the downfall of humankind, start curating some objects that belong to us and that offer different perspectives on contemporary society. So what I find really interesting here is the way in which the museum is turned into not just a theme of the collection, but really as it's turned into the organizing principle of the collection. So if you take a look at this is the table of contents, and you can see that the table of contents presents the book we are holding in our hands as the catalog of course, a fictional exhibition with a number of exhibition spaces in a permanent collection, a number of special collections, all of which are meant to offer a very ironic take on contemporary society and in humankind. So the museum becomes a formal device that structures the collection and that also distances the reader's perspective from the human scale and from the contemporary. Now, what's interesting, and I don't have time to really develop this idea, but you'll have to take my word for it, or maybe just read this beautiful book by Shaughnessy. What I find striking about this collection is the way in which the distance, the non-human perspective, if you want, provided by the octopoid overlords, turns these very quotidian textual objects, a number of letters, a number of documents, all sorts of textual artifacts, are turned into non-human matter. So that kind of distance becomes very productive in the book. And in that way, the materiality of language itself comes to the fore, I think, in a very resonant way. So the one quotation I'm going to give you from the text is the one you can see on the slide. We thought we were throwing plastic away until away threw itself back at us, which is, I think, fairly representative of that irony that runs through the collection, and also, you know, the interest in the human debris of these textual artifacts, and how that gets reinterpreted through this non-human lens of the octopi that curated this collection. Okay, so that's what I have to say about the Anthropocentrism Museum. Now we move to object-oriented plotting, which is a strategy I want to identify in multilinear narrative. So narrative that works with multiple storylines and multiple sets of characters. The defining feature of an object-oriented plot is that these multiple strands of narrative do not converge on a human protagonist, or the intentions, the desires of a human protagonist, as in traditional narrative, but actually follow the material circulation of a single object. So instead of a single protagonist bringing together the multiple strands of the book, of the narrative, we have an object that makes its way from one strand to another and brings them together in a way that I would argue displays or exposes the agency of things, the way in which things, by moving from one place to another and by moving from one owner, for example, to another, actually connect people in ways that, in ways of which people themselves may be unaware. So I'm gonna give you another example. This is a very interesting novel by a contemporary Canadian writer, Ruth Ozeki. And it is an object-oriented plot because well, it has two protagonists, one located in British Columbia, the other located in Japan. And these protagonists never meet in the story world of the novel. So they never cross paths. What brings them together is the movement of a material object. So what happens here is Nao, so the Japanese protagonist, has a diary that gets swept up by the 2011 tsunami in Japan, is lost in the ocean for a long time, and then washes up on a beach in British Columbia, where the other protagonist picks it up. So we have two separate strands of narrative with two protagonists that never physically meet. What brings them together is the movement of a material thing, a diary. So I have a very quick quotation from a tale a tale for the time being, which is the moment in which Ruth encounters the diary, or finds the diary on the beach. And I think it's a very interesting description, so I will just read it quickly. Something made Ruth stop. She leaned over and nudged the heap of kelp with the toe of her sneaker, then poked it with a stick. Untangling the whip-like fronds, she dislodged enough to see that what glistened underneath was not a dying sea jelly, but something plastic, a bag. Not surprising, the ocean was full of plastic. She dug a bit more until she could lift the bag up by its corner. It was heavier than she expected, a scarred plastic freezer bag encrusted with barnacles that spread across its surface like a rash. So what strikes me here is the way in which the metaphorical language deployed by Ozeki draws attention to the texture of this material object she observes. And it's not any kind of texture. It's a texture that I think very clearly straddles the divide between the human and the non-human. So this is a non-human thing, but it also takes on human-like quality, especially towards the end. The freezer bag is said to be scarred, and the barnacles spread across its surface like a rash. So there's this attribution of embodied qualities to a non-human thing, in a way that you could call it strategic anthropomorphism, if you want. So it's an anthropomorphizing device that actually brings out, not in a non-anthropocentric way, I would argue, the material visual texture of this object. And at the same time, this is also a passage that bridges another divide, namely the divide between this local thing, this object that can be directly manipulated, and the global scale of the tsunami or of the oceanic currents that brought the object, the diary, to British Columbia, where Ruth picks it up. So the passage bridges a number of divides. And at the same time, it is, of course, the main vector of the narrative progression. So the narrative is presented as a series of back and forths between Ruth and Nao, and they converge on this material thing that gets transported from Japan to Ruth. This strategy of what I call object-oriented plotting, of course, is not unique to Ozeki, but can actually be found in a number of contemporary narratives that take the form of a network of people, but a network that is brought together or grounded in a material thing. So two further examples are the film Babel and Don DeLillo's novel Underworld. Okay, so just a couple of things to conclude. So I try to say that material objects are pervasive in narrative. In many cases, embedding things within a story is actually a very anthropocentric gesture of presenting materiality as instrumental, as something that helps humans pursue their projects, essentially. But there are cases, and that's of course what I'm interested in, there are cases in which things can become part of stories in a way that questions anthropocentric ideologies, and whether this happens or not depends on both formal devices and stylistic or thematic strategies. So the kind of object-oriented narratology I'm imagining with this presentation is, of course, a subset of a field launched by Erin James in 2015 with this book you can see here on the slide. And that field is eco-narratology, which looks at the intersection of environmental issues, ecological issues, and narrative form. The focus, of course, in this presentation and in my current work has been on contemporary narrative, but I'm particularly interested in the other presentations that will follow, because I think some of these questions about narrative's engagement with thing power are raised by, certainly raised by other literary periods as well. And also important for me is the fact that contemporary fiction itself is looking at earlier literary forms and genres in order to essentially make up for the limitations of the bourgeois or realist novel. So there is a return of myth or of the fable or of genres like the epic in contemporary fiction that I think makes this dialogue between contemporary literary scholarship and the study of earlier literary periods particularly productive. So thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. I will also stop my share.
Thank you so much, Marco, for this very interesting kind of introductory talk to your work and this approach. And in fact, yes, you offered already a nice transition to the next talk by Sarah Blake, who is a classicist. She's an associate professor of classics at York University in Toronto. She published extensively, and let me say this is quite exceptional because, as you can imagine, this is typical of classics, that we are always a little bit late in terms of embracing new methodologies. But then I also must add that we give usually a particular twist. So I'm very excited about what Sarah has to tell us. So as I was telling you, she published extensively on this topic, and so on the presence of objects, things in classical literature, and she has a monograph. She's working on this monograph. I guess it's already almost done. The professional title is Objects, Agents, Things, Material Culture in the Ancient Roman Imagination. The title of her paper today is Reading Light, Lamps as Objects, Agents and Things in ancient studies, in ancient cultures, something like that. So Sarah, yours is the floor.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Is
yes,
this
sure.
volume good? Okay. I will just share my screen here. And okay, everyone can see this? Good? Great. Okay, thank you. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Marco, for this invitation. I'm really excited to join this conversation. Marco, that was a fabulous talk you just gave. I'm thinking everything over as we're talking, and I'm hoping this will, bring some conversation. So I started working on literary materiality, or the intersection of text and thing, as part of a dissertation project, which is when Marco Formisano, we first met. Bill Brown's famous thing theory critical inquiry issue had just come out, and at the time there was this real sense that literary studies could evolve, could turn towards the material, and there would be something revelatory about this, that thing theory would give some kind of solid ground, something new. And material culture studies appealed to me in three ways. As a Latin literature scholar in training at the time, it seemed a way to really bridge from this highly philological world of texts to this, what seemed like a far off across a chasm, these so-called subfields in classical studies, ostraca, papyri, even archaeology. These seemed to be, so divorced from what I was doing. And I hoped in turning to things that I could find some more politically appealing way to engage with the ancient world. That is to say, at the time I craved a contact with the real, a kind of a real, and with what I perceived was a non-elite ancient world. So material culture seemed, from my philologist's eyes, to open up some kind of access to real people in the ancient world. Specifically, the people that were oppressed and exploited so very casually by the class of authors that I was investing so much of my time in reading. So in this light, I think it is still possibly the most important thing to always understand for the ancient Greco-Roman world, that we have a categorically, legally, culturally defined creature, the thing person, the enslaved human being, variously referred to in ancient theories of slavery as a living tool, instrumentum vocale, talking instrument. Right? So I began in my research simply by trying to tune in to the material world, to attend to objects, and particularly to the infrastructure of ancient literature. And I wanted to show that in antiquity, we have different concepts of personhood. So yes, before this, stylized this Cartesian dualism, that rather than having a neutral, mute object world or natural world as a prop, as a background for human action, rather we have something more of a spectrum. So over the last 15, 20 years, the landscape of material cultures has changed quite a lot. I admire very much the theories of OOO and speculative materialism, and that that directive to move away from the relationship of humans and objects, and to consider objects on their own term, to be always trying to do this anyway, as they withdraw from us. Because for me, this is akin to accepting radical alterity, which is a critical political move. But at the same time, I'm especially recently really drawn back again and again to the psychological, the fantastic elements, our own speculative elements in our human-centered relationships with things. So I try always, I'm going to try to do that at the end of this talk, to reflect on my own desire for the otherness of elusive ancient objects and try to understand the dynamics of that. Okay, so I work primarily in epigram, which is a literary genre that's wonderful for thinking about things and texts. It's named from the Greek verb epigraphein, to write upon. And the literary genre evolves from the practice of inscription. So imprinting words upon a material thing, a tomb, a pot, a monument. And as it evolves into a literary genre, it brings with it always this sense of its own context. So initially, literary epigrams were fictive inscriptions, playing with their own material supports. Today I'll talk about Martial, a first century Latin CE poet, epigrammatist, who retains this kind of self-consciousness of the materiality of the poem. But I'm going to talk about lamps. I sort of chose a specific object to run through a set of sort of theoretical questions about, and lamps it is. We're going to look at a few lamps, and then I'll run through a very short series of epigrams, 6 two-line epigrams that talk about that Martial plays with the concept of the lamp, that provoke for us a question of what lamps can be and what they do in the Roman imagination. But first, a very few brief words about the so-called ordinary oil lamp, which is a luknos in Greek and lucerna in Latin. So a very common archaeological find. We have tens of thousands of them. Almost every collection of ancient objects in every museum will have, private collections, university collections will have lamps. Lamps are widely available on the antiquities market, both real and fake. And you can see here in this example, a sort of an ordinary looking lamp. But the lamp has a very long history in Greco-Roman thought as a personified, animated, lively object with a sense of its own life, and as an object that participates very intimately with people as a social agent. So here are just a few little lamps to look at. A very early one, very simple bowl formed with clay, with a little bent, the cocked hat lamp, little bent place for the wick to go. A classical Greek lamp, which is thrown on a potter's wheel, and then moving into a Hellenistic molded lamp. And here, again, a very typical sort of Roman, this is a first century discus lamp, which has a round flat surface, which typically has an image on it. Okay, so how is the lamp this intimate object? Well, we have lamps of many materials, but the primary material is terracotta or earth, which in the mythic story as well is the material crafted into people by Prometheus. And the lamp is very much, to me, like the pot or like the jug, the urn, this favorite object of thing theory, because it has this crafted, gathered sort of hollowness. There's the hidden interior, a hollow belly that's full of warm liquid. The lamp also makes noise as it burns. It cackles and it hisses from its nostril, which is the nozzle. And when it splutters, this is said to sound like a sneeze in different poetry. And it also consumes olive oil, which is food. One modern recreator determined that a lamp burning quite weakly consumes 8 grams of oil in an hour. So this is not a cheap, not an insignificant amount of oil. Famously, the lamp smells terrible as it's burning, especially when it is snuffed out. The strong scent of a lamp being snuffed out is said to cause miscarriage in horses and humans. And of course, it puts out this lively flickering warmth. So the lamp has this inherent vivacity. There's a symbolic association, of course, of lamps and lamplight with knowledge and sight, which is important and well known. A scholar named Ruth Bielefeld has very brilliantly shown this recently in her book, Ding und Mensch in der Antike, that the ancient theory of vision as external tells us that fire creates sight. So light creates sight. So in this sense, the sun's rays are said to see, and eyes are like fire. Anyway, the ancient theory of vision allows for the potential that the lamp is actually looking at us with this fire. So you can see that there are all of these ways in which the lamp shares in these human capacities, human sensory qualities. And we can see this, using the literal anthropomorphic of the lamp. So here, the famous foot or sandal-shaped lamp, a lamp in the face of a satyr or a Silenus figure. And then this beautiful object, a bronze ephebe who is a candelabrum, so that lamps would hang from the object that he's holding there. Okay. So the idea of this human-like lamp that can see you, that interacts with you in all your senses, connects to a very common idea in Greek erotic poetry, which is the lamp is a witness, it's watching you, especially at night. In this poetry, the lamp is a very common interlocutor. It's figured as a witness, spying on you perhaps, or guarding you. The poets ask the lamp to keep quiet about what it has seen, or they set it up to spy on a cheating lover. We see over and over again the lover puzzling through his emotions, typically a male lover towards a female love object, with the lamp as a participant, as a confidant. And this poetic topos, we can see a very interesting analogy to the presence of the lamps in the Greek magical papyri. So in this collection of incantations and spells, lamps are very important as part of a part of these rituals. Lamps are part of course, very important elements of public religious rituals. We have them as votive objects, as grave goods, but also in private domestic rituals, the lamp serves as, Peter Stewart has called it a portable shrine, portable altar. And the lamp in these magical spells can participate with you. The lamp can help you to interpret your dreams. The lamp is used to send dreams to your lovers, this kind of thing. Okay. So just from this very brief review, you can see that the lamp holds a sort of a special place in the object world, ancient object world. It's a material object with a culture. And the lifelikeness of the lamp and its potentially special relationship give it a certain kind of animacy. But I'm interested to know, how does the lamp come to co-participate with humans? What are the political and moral contours of the association? So is this a democratic association? How is the agency shared out, we could say? So I'm now going to turn to a specific textual portrait of the lamp as a general object in a series of Marshall's epigrams. Show you there. So there are 4 on this page and 2 on the next. So I'll just read through them quickly. These 2-line poems, these couplets, are taken from a collection called the Apophoria, or Things You Can Take Away With You from a Party, is a good translation of that title. This is a collection of 225 epigrams, each of which describes a single poem, a single object. So we have a title just saying what the object is, and then we have a 2-line poem. The poem could be a pun, it could be a riddle, it can be something a little bit pithy, a little bit salty. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're boring, sometimes they're inexplicable. It's a real variety. Marshall's sort of poetic fireworks, showing how he can describe all of these hundreds of objects in just 2 lines in different ways. Included in this collection are all kinds of objects, from ordinary household things, soap, pencil, toothbrush, dumbbells, to very fancy, expensive things, including enslaved people. So a dancer, a boy who can sing, a cook, a pastry chef, that kind of thing. And the fiction of the collection as a whole is that these objects are things that you would give to your guests at a party, or that you would send at the Saturnalia. The Apophoria also, this importantly, is arranged in matching pairs or contrasting pairs. So each object, an object for a rich person is paired with an object for a poor person. So poem 39 here, bedroom lamp, is for a rich man, while poem 40 is contrasted with it as a poem for a poor man. Okay. Throughout the 6 poems I'll show you, each one repeats the word lucerna, as Marshall gives us variations on lamps, but also on not lamps. Interestingly, in this series of descriptions, there actually are few descriptions. There's almost no clue as to what these objects look like, their aesthetic qualities. Rather, the poems are all interested in the use of the object and the object's own sense of its own use and usefulness. But I want to argue that each poem also offers a slightly shifting version of the object itself. So to poem 39, Bedroom Lamp. As a lamp and confidant of your sweet little bed, you may do whatever you want, I will be silent, which is paired with poem 40, Candle. The lot, by luck, you've received a slave girl for your lamp. She spends the whole night awake. Okay. So in poem 39, the Lucerna cubicularis, the bedroom lamp, takes up the conventions of the lamp in erotic Greek poetry as this nighttime interlocutor. The lamp is konskia, is aware, is alert. And we have the ironical play, the final word of the epigram, takebo, I will be silent. The voiceless inanimate object pledges to continue to be silent, right? So the joke plays on this drift between sensate and insensate. Poem 40, its pair, also describes a feminine noun, cicindella, which actually means glowworm in Latin, but here is a candle, probably. And this candle is given by luck to a poor man, in keeping in conceit with the conceit of the volume. It's called an ankila, which is a slave girl for a lamp. So ankila is very unusual of an object. I don't have any other parallel for this usage. And of course, ankila typically means a female slave, possibly young, but can be of any age. So the epigram, as a pair, they draw us closer to this idea that the bedroom lamp and the candle are meant to invoke female slaves, attendants who are sexually available in the bedroom, ready all night long, wide awake, and silent, uncomplaining. The lamp and the lamp's candle, they could speak, but they don't. They stay awake all night without the need for sleep. So they're human-like, but then they retain this thingy, objectified quality. Okay. So I'll turn now to the pair of 41 and 42. In 41, a lamp with many wicks, polymikos. So although I light whole banquets with my flames and bear so many wicks, I am called just a single lamp. And in 42, wax candle. This wax candle will give you light at night, for the lamp has been stolen from your puer, from your slave boy. Okay. So again, another speaking object, the polymikos, the fancy lamp, speaks out, and it's complaining that even though it's lavish and powerful and beautiful, it is still just called a lucerna, a lamp, this indignity. Its special extravagance, its skill is flattened out in its name. And I'll just show you, I have here an example of what an object like this might have looked like. This is a bronze multi-nozzled, you can see here. These are female faces and ships' prows alternating around this glorious, beautiful object. This object is paired with a single wax candle. The paired poem 42, however, is about the absence of a lamp. So there is no lucerna. Instead of a lucerna, which has been stolen from this slave boy, did the slave boy fall asleep? Did he lose the lamp? We don't know. A candle is substituted. Right? In both senses, it doesn't really matter the form of the object, any of its formal qualities. It's reduced to its function, which is to provide light. Okay. And just two more quick poems to look at in the series. 43 and 44, both about candelabra. So candelabra would be stands like the one of the bronze Ephebe I showed you, where lamps would hang from elaborate objects, not holding individual candles, but lamps rather, which explains a little bit poem 43. Candles gave me my ancient name. The well-oiled lamp did not know our thrifty, our cheap forefathers. That is, at the time, these fancy lamps were unknown to our forefathers who had only the candle. And in poem 44, a cheaper version, a wooden candelabrum, a speaking object again, you see that I am wood. Unless you watch over the light, you will have a huge lamp made from the lampstand. That is a fireball. I will catch fire. Okay. So in this pair, the metal, the rich, expensive, elaborate object, the candelabrum of Corinthian bronze, is named by the single, simple candle. So a mismatch again between name and thing. While in 44, the wooden candelabrum needs a constant eye, a constant vigilance, or else it will turn into a fireball, thereby doing the exact opposite of what lamp technology in all of its forms was designed to do, which is to control and mediate the dangers of fire in order that humans might safely use it. So those are our 6 weird, lively lamps in Marshall's epigrams. They're animate, yet objectified and reduced to their role as instruments. However, they leave the impression of a kind of a chattery bunch of special things. I'll just go back up and look at the foursome for the moment. Okay, so I want to point out a thematic linkage in this chain of epigrams. There's a strong association here between slaves and lamps. The objects can perform the work of slaves, but without the failures of the human. So the bedroom slave lamp, as we saw, is awake all night and is discreet, is not going to tell your secrets. This is not a quality associated with slaves in antiquity who were famously untrustworthy in their speech. And the candle also is not going to fall asleep. The slave character that appears in poem 42, the puer, has fallen asleep perhaps, has lost the lamp. So in this sense, objects have replaced faulty slaves. But can we take these 6 poems as a masterly fantasy of perfect animated object slaves? No, because in each case, there's a sense of what I just call shiftiness, a slight unease. The fiction of the poems is that we don't know the mind or the intention of these mostly silent objects. The emotional notes of these poems, I would say, are vigilance. There's a sense of vigilance, both by the objects and over the objects needed, and the potential trouble of objects, and by the shift, the object, the slave as the object. So lamps in these poems have an obvious agency, or the obvious fiction of agency, in that they can speak, they stay awake, they fit into this particular kind of agency. However, I would say is limited. It conforms to the ideological scaffolding of slave owning and slave management, as we see it in all other aspects of Roman culture. The objects are concerned primarily with their own service, and they require vigilance. There lurks also this sense of danger that the object might turn on you, set your house on fire, for example. But I want to close by asking, who is the you? Right? This series of poems interpolate a reader who is also a slave owner and a slave manager, and also an object master. So in summary, there's a real tangle of ideas here about the object, which includes the fantasy or the fear that the object shifts, can destroy, at the same time that it is titillating, satisfying, and can be a companion. The fantasy includes this comic complaint of the resentful lamp that's not given enough praise for its beauty. So in one sense, the series of poems plays out for me what I think of as that imaginative life, the playful life that is made possible or is possible with ordinary objects. Some of the objects speak for themselves, as we saw 4 of the 6 speak for themselves. I think originally the collection was intended for use at a party. So you can imagine these poems being read out with a visual prop, maybe using different funny voices, acting out, embodying the objects in this kind of social setting, both as a reader and as a listener. So my very final thought here is that Marshall, the epigrammatist, is often credited with a kind of a gritty realism because of the material aspects of his poetry: pots, chamber pots, sandals, wilting veggies, goats, this kind of thing. But I think we can see in this short series that the poems are a conversational play for a masterly class amongst themselves about mischievous, troublesome objects. So there's really no access here to the enslaved person's use of the object, for example. There's just only this continuous blurring, cycling back of slave to object to slave to object, this ontological confusion, which should provoke horror, but instead here is activated to provide a textual delight and a textual pleasure. The ancient oil lamp, kind of more generally, as you can see in any online collection, or if we ever go back to museums, in any museum, is described as an ordinary object, a common object. And it's often pitched as something that provides a lifeline that really can forge a living, active, vital connection to the ancient past. There's even stories of lamps, that burned unattended in tombs for centuries and only were snuffed out when the tomb was finally opened in modern times. So there's this sense of continuous life spanning the Great Break, right? And also, as we said, the lamp affords this sensory intimacy. So you can imagine, what did the ancient people who used this object see? What did they smell? It feeds a fantasy of feeling along with ancient users of the object. But I think ultimately Marshall's little series on the shifting lamp creature reminds us that the lamp maybe was not as ordinary as we think. The poor man, as we saw, at best has a candle. And remember also that the lamp burned food, and that to choose to stay up late at night, whether relaxing or working by lamplight, was certainly the privilege of the masterly class. So these political moral contours must affect, I think, our desire for contact with these lifelike objects from the past. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, it is very intriguing, and I very much look forward to discussing this with you and of course the other participants. And yeah, as I told you, I propose to make just a very short break, 5 minutes. We are late. You both, Marco and Sarah, were great, but a little bit too long, I must say. But it's okay. I mean, I really enjoyed both talks. So I would say we are going to meet at 8:05. Okay, so just 5 minutes to have a glass of water or something. Okay.
Advocated prominently, for example, by David Levy, who in his book with eye-catching title, Love and Sex with Robots. And in this book, he conceives of robots as reliable partners which will fulfill all our needs. So here we have a very clear dichotomy of the active human subject and the passive non-human object. More critical approaches coming from post-human studies and new materialist studies, however, they draw our attention to the fact that we never can be in control of machines or things or objects. So there will always be something that withdraws, and that's what I'm interested in now. So the machine beyond our control. And when we have a look at many science fiction texts or films where robots are important or play an important role, and most of these texts and films, they end with a robot uprising. So there isn't this idea that Levy advocates, this idea of the reliant robot partner. And the idea of the machine beyond our control very much has to do with the idea that there's a force inherent in things. And this idea is presented, among others, by Jane Bennett in her book, Vibrant Matter. Marco already mentioned it. And in this book, Bennett puts forward the idea that there's always a force inherent in inanimate things, which enables them to animate, to act, to produce affect, dramatic and subtle. And these kind of affects, dramatic and subtle at the same time, that's what also plays an important role in the literary text I want to present now. And I'm only focusing on one literary example, and this is a long poem by the Swedish Nobel laureate Harry Martinson. In Swedish, it's Anjara, en revue om människan i tid och rum. In English, it's Anjara, a review of man and time and space, or as it was translated later, an epic science fiction poem. And the poem originally was published in 1956, and it was very, very popular by the time. It was translated immediately in many languages. It was adapted into an opera, and yeah, everyone loved this poem. But after 1970s, it was widely forgotten. But recently we can see a new interest in this poem, and the reason for this new interest, of course, has to do with the story which is told in the poem, and it's a story about a spaceship, the titular spaceship Anjara, that is supposed to bring thousands of passengers from the ravaged Earth to their new home planet Mars, but drifts off course. In the first years of the travel, the passengers find comfort in the half-sentient machine Mima, and that's the machine I'm interested in. And this machine consoles the passengers with dream-like images. But after the machine, overwhelmed by despair, itself self-destructs, the passengers are doomed to continue onwards through space with nothing but the darkness of their guilt in front of them. So, and that's very interesting that we here have a kind of artificial intelligent machine that the first thing that is interesting is that this kind of machine is not presented as a humanoid robot, but more or less like a kind of TV screen. And the other thing is that this machine is presented as sentient, but we do not meet the machine in an uprise, but we have to do with a machine who is desperate. And why is the machine desperate? The machine is desperate because of humankind, because the humans have destroyed the earth. And I read this machine with thing theories coming from Heidegger's inspiration. I read this machine as an example of the broken thing. And to do this, I make use of Heidegger and Heidegger's interest in the thingness of things and his differentiation between the readiness to hand and the presence as hand. And this differentiation has been very important for Bill Brown, who has been mentioned already. And in his very important article, Thing Theory, which was published in 2001 in a special issue of Critical Inquiry titled Things. And in this article, Brown drew attention to things and thingness as new objects of literary studies, and highlighting literature's ability to make the thingness of objects visible, he draws on Heidegger's distinction between object and thing. And according to Heidegger, humans normally use things without theorizing. Things are ready to hand. And only when things fail, when something goes wrong, when they are lacking, we see the thing as present at hand, just being there. And Brown and also Graham Harman, Marco also referred to, Brown identifies the new perception of the thing as the beginning of a new dynamic between human subject and non-human object. And he points out, we begin to confront the thingness of objects when they stop working for us, when the drill breaks, when the car stalls, when the window gets filthy, when their flow within the circuits of production and distribution, consumption and exhibition has been arrested, however momentarily. When it comes to my literary example, however, we can see that the breakdown of things means much more. So we have this machine, this MIMA, and the name MIMA, of course, relates the machine to the arts. It's a mimetic machine. The machine can transfer images and sounds from other galaxies and also from Earth. And this machine is presented as a machine that cheers the passengers with, all things from space. And by doing so, the machine helps the people to forget their traumatic memories. And due to these comforting qualities, the machine is adored by the passengers as godlike. So they really regard the machine as a useful object, a kind of fetish, which gives power to the people, but has no power herself. But this understanding changes when MIMA, the machine, malfunctions. The passenger's world of dreams bursts as MIMA one day transmits pictures of a nuclear explosion on Earth and the irreversible end of all living beings. And the pictures that the machine transmitted affect the machine herself very much. So the machine is also addressed as female. So the machine is affected very much. However, it's not quite clear why. So we have no direct insight into the machine's thoughts and feelings, but it's quite interesting because the machine reports pictures she has seen on Earth and reports from other people, and these other people are already presented as dead. And it's quite hard to explain, and it's also a bit mystic in the poem. But the people MIMA talks about, they refer to stones. So they have heard stones crying, and in the poem we read, so the dead man did his speaking in a stone, and some lines later, referring to two men telling the story, they cry out from stones, one with the other. And another important figure in the poem, the MIMA rope, it's a kind of operator of the machine MIMA, and he comes to the conclusion, and that's, so to speak, the take-home message of the whole poem. He comes to the insight, there's protection from near everything, but there's no protection from mankind. So, what I want to highlight here is the reaction of the machine itself. The MIMA rope, the operator of the machine, explains what's going on in the machine. And his explanation reads like this. She, as a MIMA, the machine, had heard them cry. Who? The stones. She had heard them cry their stonely cries in distant Doris Vale. Doris Vale, that's the earth. She had beheld the granite's white hot weeping when stone and ore were vaporized to mist. She had been much troubled by those stones' travail. Now In the name of things, she wanted peace. Now she would be done with her displays. And it was actually this line that struck me. Now, in the name of things, she wanted peace. So in the 1950s, when Harry Mattinson published this poem, there was no thing theory like this. But he was interested in this question of materiality, of thingness, and he invents a machine, a thing that identifies with other things. And that's even the more important because the machine, Mima, is of course created by humans, but the machine comforts the humans, but nevertheless, when the machine recognizes that the whole earth is destroyed, she does not identify, she does not really show feelings for the humans, but she identifies with other things, and here with stones that are blown away. And so what happened on Earth? It's a nuclear catastrophe, and yeah, stones are vaporized to mist. And as I said, the machine identifies with this. So why are stones so important? When we look in the cultural history of the West, stones are the epitome of the hard and the rigid. And this is precisely why they are used to emphasize that something shows strong emotions against expectations. And we have some interesting examples in very old text. For example, in the Old Testament, in the book of Habakkuk, we read, "For the stone will cry out from the wall." And in a similar way, in the New Testament, in Luke, it reads, "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out." Without going into detail here, in both quotes, the crying stones are mentioned to remind people of their guilt. And likewise, in the first book of Virgil's Aeneid, when Aeneas watches a mural on which the long ago Battle of Troy is depicted, he exclaims, and now I'm building a bridge to my dear colleagues from Latin antiquity, he exclaims, "Sunt lacrima rerum et mentem mortalia tangent," which can be translated as "there are tears of things and mortal matters touch the mind." The context of the scene is, as in the biblical examples, one of guilt and destruction, but at the same time also of compassion and melancholy, because Aeneas remembers the death. And that's exactly, or more or less exactly, the same situation we also have in the Anyara poem. So here we have humans who have become guilty of the destruction of Earth, and there's a great amount of melancholy between them. In 2006, the literary scholar Peter Schwenger used the phrase "tears of things" as title for his book, The Tears of Things, Melancholy and Physical Objects, in which he explores the loss humans feel when sensing that things are indifferent to us, although we long so much to be close to them. Thus, the melancholy Schwenger is interested in is not the melancholy of objects, but of the representations by which they are mediated. In the light of recent materialistic thing theories, the representation of the weeping Mima, the machine in our poem, is quite more radical. Here it's really the sadness of the thing, the sadness of the machine, the despair of things, which is emphasized. The poem was adapted quite recently into a science fiction movie, and the movie presents the exploding Mima with an image like this one. So we suddenly everything turns gray and we see small bits of ashes flying around. And in another scene, we have already seen a similar image, but there we have seen birds falling down from Earth. So here we have a parallel between the self-destroying machine and the destruction, the destruction of nature. So I think that's quite interesting, and I read this empty or this nearly empty picture also as a kind of the crying machine. So this small flakes of ashes could also be read as the tears of the machine. More or less at the same time, the poem was also adapted to a graphic novel, and the author of the graphic novel was a bit more explicit. So his representation of the crying Mima looks like this. First, we see that Mima is not any longer a non-humanoid machine, but it's represented as a female figure. But nevertheless, what's interesting here is that we see the machine, the thing, Mima, crying in a very excessive way, and her tears are there are so many tears that the whole world drowns into tears. So what shall we do with this? I think, or I would like to read the poem and also the film and the graphic novel as an example of presenting the machine, the broken machine, as something that discloses the human being as guilty of the destruction of the world. And by identifying with the crying stones and telling the humans about this, Mima gives a voice to things. And I would like to close my short presentation with a poem by Ursula Le Guin, The Marrow. And I do this because here we have another example. We have a lyrical eye that wants to understand stones, but isn't able to. But in the end, she is, but not because of her intellect, but it's her body that connects to the stones in a quite specific way. There was a word inside a stone. I tried to pry it clear, mallet and chisel, pick and get, until the stone was dropping blood. But still I could not hear the word the stone had said. I threw it down beside the road among 1,000 stones, and as I turned away it cried the word aloud within my ear, and the marrow of my bones heard and replied. So it's not the human being with its intellectual capacities that can connect with the stones. It's the body, it's the marrow of the bones which connects to the stones. So that was my short presentation on crying things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie, for this very interesting and fascinating talk, and I look forward also in this case for the discussion. Can you go out from the presentation, please?
Yes, of course. Sorry.
Yeah. Now, yeah, our next speaker is Glenn Pierce, who is a professor of art history at Syracuse University. Glenn published already many interesting articles and books and book chapters. I had the chance of reading some of them for my own work. I won't mention them, but I'd like to point to his book just came out, if I'm correct, with the title Animism, Materiality and Museums. How do Byzantine Things Feel? 2021 with the Arc Humanity Press. His talk tonight, of course, is on Byzantine things and into the world. This is his title. Thank you so much, Glenn. And you can also share a presentation if you want to.
Right. No, thank you, Marco, for that really kind introduction. And it's been a real pleasure being here today with you all. So my brief remarks today are intended to give, sorry, I'm going to advance. Here we are. So here's the title of the book, or rather the cover of the book that Marco mentioned. My brief remarks today are intended to give some intellectual and experiential background to this book, Animism, Materiality and Museums, which was published earlier this month. It's available in open access if anyone's interested. It represents a still provisional understanding, or rather statement of my own thinking about the vitality of matter in the Byzantine world, how we might understand historical objects outside Cartesian categories, and how we might allow such historical objects to speak, if not with their natural voices, then in voices that are true and authentic to some of their meanings and work. So in this short talk, I'm going to lean into ekphrasis quite heavily in order to give freedom to these things and to the spaces of these things, not to take their voice if I can help it, and to, again, adopt a position of description over interpretation as a recognition of the alterity, even the radical alterity that Sarah has mentioned already. My own experience of taking or accepting things on their own terms came to me in direct proportion to the number of times I was able to visit the Menil collection in Houston, Texas. Now, Texas receives a lot of bad press, and it has to be said, it also lives up to some of the characters. But after having lived there for 20 years, I can also say it has extraordinary treasures of culture and art, none more than the Menil, where art can very often speak for itself. Without the interference of signage and labels, they're kept to the barest of minimum. And where objects and humans are encouraged in every possible way to engage in a mutual interrogation. And I should really stress that mutuality, that objects and humans are given almost equal footing insofar as a modern museum can allow to engage in this mutual interrogation. I can say many other things about the Menil collection, but the former Byzantine Chapel Fresco Museum was fundamentally formative to my own thinking and feeling about things. For my work on the materiality of Byzantine art, which is my specialization, indeed for the intuition on the vibrancy of that materiality, led to my work on animism, and that space totally remade me. It began with my teaching, since I would very often bring students from Austin, about a 3-hour drive away. And the time in that space just got longer, deeper, more moving each time I brought a group to Houston. So the reflections I'm offering today are nostalgic because the fresco chapel is no longer. It was rescued by the and installed in Houston with the permission of the Church of Cyprus. The chapel was in place in Texas from 1997 until 2012. And then it was returned not to its original site, That's on the northern side of the Green Line in Turkish territory, but rather to a museum in Nicosia, the still divided capital of the island. So looking back in this way is both pleasurable and saddening, because that was a unique space to encounter and experience the very particular conditions of Byzantine art insofar as we can know them. It was a space that showed something more distilled and expansive in its framing of that art. The framing might be said to suspend or even suppress the art's attempt at expressing its place in the world in its own terms. But I would argue that the freedom given it in this place allowed it to say even more eloquently and movingly what it could say in its village context in Cyprus. The chapel does qualify as an object out of place, a category of objects sometimes called by the acronym OOPS, object out of place syndrome. And if that allows us to see and experience such an object in ways that challenge and undermine our preconceived notions, then so be it. It's also a heterotopia, of course, because it also places the chapel in Texas and in Cyprus simultaneously and in a mutually subversive way. The space then, it does begin with a parking lot, but that's Texas. And then you cross a water channel to enter into the compound. Hints of Buddhism were intended, so another heterotopia multiplying. And you experience a building that is a concrete shell, not very Cypriot, of course. It also encompasses a courtyard or cloister reminiscent of a monastic complex. And what awaits you inside has to be approached with due preparation. So there is a chamber for transition, and that decompression in a vestibule. This is looking up into the skylight, where eyes and mind, if that's what it is, are readied. And then the interior, a space quite unlike any other I've met in a museum or historical context. The heart of the building was this darkened shell called an infinity box by the architect. It was lit by natural light washing down the walls, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, and spots that focused attention on the outline of a chapel in the center of the space. The inner chapel is built to the same scale as the historical building in Cyprus, and it is both that solid entity and something phantomish for the housing of the looted frescoes. The Russian doll nesting here of a building in a building reveals the reliquary-like setting too. So criticism of the strong aestheticization and preciousness of the fresco setting might well be right. But it was also a consecrated space. Liturgy was performed in this museum space as well. So oops meets heterotopia again. The frescoes are placed in another frame, a structure of frosted glass and metal rod sutures. You can tell I'm flipping back and forth between past and present tenses. I still, almost a decade later, haven't quite got used to the fact that this no longer exists. The frescoes then were only visible in this fashion, partial and through these sutures and glass. And it's only when you went into the center of the infinity box did the infinity really open up. And this is where I learned again and again how space makes a viewer. That is how space performs the viewing subject, how humans are remade in the image of these assemblages of things. So the Christ Pantocrator was visible in the dome above, only from that position in the center of the building, within the building. And in the apse was an epiphany of Virgin and Child with archangels that mediate the about to begin judgment initiated above in the dome. The frescoes are the surviving portions of an original 13th century program, but beyond these orphans, we know almost nothing about the overall program, the patron, painter, or even the local saint to whom the chapel was dedicated. So this place was the catalyst for my project. And as I said, I intended to lean into this ekphrasis in order to understand and to feel that particular compelling agency of things that resists my articulation. There are special ways of acting on me, on us, and making us their own. The project also became, as I say, a reclamation initiative, since the chapel has multiple lives, only one of which intersected in Houston with mine. Here are the versions of the chapel in Nicosia in the upper left-hand corner, near Lisi in the bottom, and then in Houston in the upper right-hand corner. And here again, in the upper left, Nicosia, right, Houston, and the absence of the apse in the chapel as it exists in Lisi on Cyprus now. There's more to be said, I could say more, about the unstable morphing identities of these paintings, which reflect our own unstable morphing reactions to them across continents and across military boundaries. Historical things, as we know, don't stand still. It's hard to name that chapel in Houston as, it's hard not to name that chapel in Houston as my most formative experiencing that active subject formation led to an ambition to make an argument for the demonstrable life of objects, which I was able to realize in an exhibition called Byzantine Things in the World in the summer of 2013. And this is the cover of the exhibition. I wanted to try to argue for the animacy and autonomy of Byzantine objects by letting them enter into a conversation that they would only encounter at the Minial collection. So the art would enter into conversation with paintings of the American and European tradition, the modern tradition, which included Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko, Robert Rauschenberg, Yves Klein, and Willem de Kooning, among others, and also non-Western art, primarily from sub-Saharan Africa. So the idea was to find a way to express, not to imitate, to find a way to realize in a museum setting the intensity of the aura around something like the icon of the Virgin at Sednaya, which is on the left-hand side of the screen. It's an early Byzantine icon in Syria today. And it's an important shrine because of the icon that's clad, hidden underneath all of the silver and other votive offerings. The icon itself was an active body in its world. It grew its own lactating breasts, which were healing sources for visiting Christians and for Muslims, Christians, both Latin and Greek and others as well. So it's an important shrine that bridges different communities and faiths. I wasn't aiming in the exhibition, a snapshot as you can see on the right-hand side, which I'll talk a little bit more about. I wasn't aiming for piety or any kind of orthodox decorum exactly, but rather to replicate as much as one can in an Anthropocenic museum, the power in these objects that gave them their subject forming capacities. I can say for certain now that my sense of control over the argument was overconfident. One thing I learned was how much more those objects had to show, to teach, to reform me than I had imagined possible. It was a great gift. In fact, the name of the book that I've already mentioned was supposed to be Byzantine Things into the World. The editors wouldn't let me use that title. It was too close to the original title, but it was that sense of these things entering into the world in a new way, which then reformed my own thinking and feeling about these historical objects. So let me try to express these ideas briefly with just one room from the show. The exhibition book was, as I say, just a provisional statement. And therein lies the reason for animism, materiality, and museums to try to catch up with and to recognize those lessons the objects taught me. It began to become apparent to me almost immediately upon the show's opening that I simply didn't know these objects well enough, that they had a great deal more to show and to teach me. And I needed to somehow find a way to recognize the surplus that they'd kept to themselves and still retain to a large degree. So this room was halfway through the exhibition. And it had a memorable intensity, which I think the photographs still capture a little of. The real eye catcher is in the center of the photograph. It's called The Halo by James Lee Byers from 1985. And on the right-hand side are two polished brass orbs from 1967 by Lucio Fontana. But the real star, despite the photograph's scale, was the small gold box that you see now, which was in the vitrine on the left-hand side. It dates to approximately 500. Probably comes from the Balkans, probably Macedonia. It had pride of place in the exhibition book, as you already saw. I can't describe it at any length here, but the idea was to demonstrate the mystery of vision from a place like Sednaya here in this room, how some materials and materialities destabilize themselves, come alive, and extend their reach into all entities within their orbits. I use things purposefully as a way to indicate a horizontal world in which all these things are relational individuals, not individuals, but divisible entities. And this small box more than held its own despite the scales within the photograph. That's one experiential element that doesn't communicate as well. And that was the hope, that the subject really was the small golden box. It only became clear just what kind of energy and relationality the box has when it began its conversation with these things it hadn't met before. So it was a conversation of acquaintance, of becoming acquaintance. So here's another view in the room to the right-hand side. The Fontana again, the lower left. Yves Klein's monogold Untitled from 1960, a late Byzantine icon, and a Rauschenberg Untitled gold painting from 1956. Now the box merged, reflected, and catalyzed their humans within their conversation. Viewers also consistently tried to touch the gold and the brass that was available for touch in the room. They had to post a special guard to keep people off the things. There's something deeply charismatic about these objects and their materialities. In the end, I was won over to their reactive, quiet life that felt us back in their ways that are so much slower and thoroughgoing and resistant to our verbal articulation. The thingness of the box emerges from close description of the materiality, and I did try to do that in my writing, and what that materiality could mean in its original context. That's our job as historians. Aesthetically, one can argue all cultures enjoyed the color and sheen of worked gold. Notions of the ore's meaning in terms of historical geology are significant because the material was understood on some level in antiquity in the Byzantine world as living. To let the objects tell their story of animation in an imaginative and true way. I also explored aspects of alchemy, the ways in which gold pulls other lesser materials along in its wake towards a greater perfection that in some slow, inevitable way that gold performs. And I was also interested in exploring the different kinds of vitality of gold as such. And about a decade ago, in fact, biologists had done a study in India around a region where a number of gold mines are found. And they did a number of tests on men who work in the mines versus those who didn't. And one of the striking aspects of their findings was the stronger motility of the sperm of the men who worked in the mines as opposed to those who did not. But there's something intuitively vital about gold, but there is something actually vital about gold as well. Gold is also thought to be in the ancient and medieval worlds water formed. It's basically a viscous material. And that's partly because in the ancient world it was produced primarily from alluvial deposits, not from mines, so that its connections with water was recognized thoroughly. So these are aspects of the historical record that allowed these kinds of meanings within a room like this to emerge more forcefully. So in its remaking, the gold box showed that formative element in its viscous shimmer, go back just for a sec, in the vacillation between its solid and liquid forms that light across its sheeting enlivens, the divine manifested itself in this very demonstration of geological performance. Materials were still present even when they're made into something, and things continue to be caught up with their users in the fluxes of the medium, as Tim Ingold has shown us so well. So in their characteristic way, objects abstract themselves under varying conditions. Lambent materials like gold and silver reflect and absorb light to the degree that individual qualities of color and texture shift to sheen and generalization. That never comes out in photography, which also settles and stabilizes what one sees. Figuration loses its identity in these objects, and regardless of iconographic content, integrity of object is always lost under sensual scrutiny of the user, holder, and/or viewer, where integrity dissolves, transforming relation among objects and human subjects came into play. And that became clear too in the exhibition. So this might be a way for me to talk about taking objects on their own terms and the lessons I learned by doing so. I discovered it's possible when you're willing to give up some of your own free will and assumption of human priority and discretion. It's a good thought experiment, and it's even better as an ethics experiment, I think, in the ways that Sarah mentioned in embracing that radical alterity. If we take all things on their own terms, which is really hard to do, then we might get closer to a democracy of individuals. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was also splendid. And I remember when I invited you, Glenn, you told me quite enthusiastically, things are really my thing. So here we go. And of course, yeah, that museum is fantastic. I would like so much to visit as soon as we are able to move around the globe. This is one of my favorite. I've been in Houston, but yeah, many years ago, but I didn't have the occasion. So we have, very little time for questions. And I don't know if someone already know. There is no no questions from the audience. Would you like? I would like to present a brief.
There's a hand by Roberta.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, of course, Roberta. You can.
Yes, sorry. My camera perhaps won't work. I will try to, because I have a bad connection. So I was just. It's about the first. It's more a reaction and a question, perhaps, to the first three presentations. That is, I was intrigued by the fact that this is all about, things, but at the end, 3 out of 4 presentations were very much about texts. Even, the classics lamp presentation was about that. So I was wondering how you see texts as perhaps artifacts or intertwined with artifacts, and if it is a sort of European way of looking even at things. Even when we look at things, we end up speaking of text. It's just a question that perhaps is for even, Sophie's a talk, which was incredibly interesting at the end, is about a poem.
Perhaps I can respond quickly to that, if that's okay, Marco. Yeah, that's a great point. It's what I was trying to discuss in my reading of the Shaughnessy collection, because there are multiple ways of thinking about textuality, and you're right. I think there's in Western modernity there's a strong tendency to think about text as something disembodied and far from materiality, something cerebral, intellectual, and whatnot. But of course, texts are also things, right? And we can look at them from the perspective of materiality in a number of ways, starting from typography and the physical properties of inscription, going all the way to the way in which texts draw our attention to the things that surround us in the physical world. So that's precisely the kind of attention to textuality that I was trying to bring out in my reading. Thank you.
I'd like also to add that I feel partially responsible because, of course, I am a literary scholar and I collected my people following my own interests. Of course, now Glenn is, it happened that I was in touch with him, but this is what, I mean, you, Roberta, really identified. So would you like both Sophie and Sarah react to this, or?
Yes, well, it's fine. That is, it's just, you know, the way we talk about things is very much, you know, through texts that I find interesting.
Right. Yeah. So Sophie and Sarah, if you.
Yeah, but so to take up was Marco was indicating. I mean, when I look at my material, and I could have developed it further, that the different adaptations of the original text, I mean, that would be another possibility to deal with the question of things. I mean, here the materiality of the artificial object comes into play. First, we have the book, the poem, and then we have a film and a graphic novel, and we also have an opera and another musical theater play. So that's an interesting point. I mean, you could also follow this line of transformation of an idea in different media. And yeah, so just thank you for this input.
Yeah, perhaps Sarah, if you agree, I would like to add a brief observation to your talk, which is directly related to this other observation. So I really appreciated in your talk as a Latinist that you showed us in a very concrete way how a text can work as an object, which is basically also what Marco and now Sophie were also arguing. And I would like to point to a very interesting aspect, which is, of course, for a Latinist, is a normal thinking about brevitas, about the fact that those epigrams are very short, and the very fact that they are short, this is kind of, I mean, emphasize, in my opinion, also their thingness. They are in series, so there is a seriality. They are portable. Apophoreta means precisely that you can take them away. So there is really an identification, and there is a plurality. So there is an identification between the thing itself and the poem as an object. And I really like the idea to watch at poetry also in this sense. So this is what I partially tried to do also with my own works, with my own pieces of poetry, which are not immediately related to an object. But this brings me to the point that really every text, even texts that are not thematizing or are directly related to objects, are in fact objects themselves, and we might observe them rather than read it. They have angles, they have a certain liminality in the space. So I think, I mean, this conversation was really great for me, from my own limited perspective as a classicist, of course. And yeah, this was my thought about the specificity of Sarah. I could talk for hours, but this is not, yeah. And I don't know if Sarah would like to say something both about Roberta's observation and this of mine.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Roberta. I'm a huge fan of your work, so it's a very exciting conversation to have. I find generally in Latin, it's difficult to escape the text. As Marco was just saying, with Marshall's epigrams, these brief things there, the the shape of the text is meant to invoke the inscribed object, right? It's meant to convey to you the sense that there is a portable object in your hand with this little text on it. And I think with this text in particular, I try to think of the performance context of it and imagine what the visual cues would have been, how this text would have been embodied and not only, you know, heard as well as seen, to place epigrams back into an epigram book and what it looks like on the scroll, or in Marshall's case, perhaps a codex. So we have kind of interesting shifting textual forms even. Certainly the idea with the apophoria is that they are meant to be almost detachable tags. So the, you know, a piece of a page might be ripped out and that then corresponds to an object. So I think in this particular text, there's a lot of things you can do with the interplay or the fragmentary nature of the text and the close relationship of epigram to object. I think in other texts, there's always, you know, the philological text as we have it is this crystallized, perfect, sanitized object that's kind of black boxing, right? It's covering up all the work of the editors and the multiple manuscript tradition and all of the potentially different ways it could look. So Marshall's collection looks different. Sometimes there's 224, sometimes there's 223. The poems are ordered differently. So the material, thinking of the materiality of text just brings this wonderful instability to these to philological classical Latin text, which it's just so much work. You know, I find it so hard to escape from all of the sort of rigors of trying to do a philological analysis and then to be, you know, disrupting yourself again and again with the material aspects. But it's so, I think it's so critical just to even, you know, to blow up that idea of the perfect, stable text.
Right. This is very rewarding in my idea. So I'm very thankful. And yeah, it's late. We must come to a close. Let me thank you all. That was just fantastic. And thank you for your time. I know that everybody is very busy right now and stressed with this online teaching. So I really appreciate your effort to be with us, to present your work also in a very accessible way. Right. I mean, this is, I mean, everybody could engage with your particular approaches. So thank you so much. And I hope we'll see each other soon again. So until next time, I hope. Ciao, bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
Ciao Marco. Alla prossima.
Ciao.